Chapter 12. Night in the Slammer. The Lesser Mudbury Jail was not accustomed to housing guests of distinction. Its usual occupants were more likely to be inebriated farmers or the occasional chicken thief. Yet on this particular evening, it suddenly found itself playing host to two of the most unlikely inmates in its long and undistinguished history: Mrs. Penelope Brockett and her soused maid, Mabel. Constable Clutterbuck, a man whose dedication to the law was matched only by his fondness for a quiet life, led the two women down the narrow corridor with the air of a man escorting particularly volatile explosives. "Now then, ladies," he said, his voice a study in forced cheerfulness. "It's just for one night, mind. A bit of time to reflect on the day's, events." Mrs. Brockett, still resplendent in her funeral attire, now adorned with an eclectic mix of grave dirt, mortuary mementos, and what appeared to be a piece of the late Reverend Pimsley's boutonniere, drew herself up to her full height. The effect was somewhat diminished by the fact that she was still swaying slightly from her ordeal in the grave. "Constable Clutterbuck," she began, her voice dripping with the kind of disdain usually reserved for clergymen who suggested charitable donations. "Surely you don't mean to suggest that I, Mrs. Penelope Brockett, should be incarcerated like some common criminal?" Clutterbuck, demonstrating the survival instincts that had kept him alive through many a village fate gone wrong, merely smiled placatingly. Now, Mrs. Brockett, Bishop's orders, I'm afraid. Said something about cooling off periods and preserving what's left of the moral fabric of Lesser Mudbury." As they approached the cell, Mabel, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, suddenly perked up. "Ooh, look at that, Mrs. B. Iron bars and everything, just like in them penny dreadfuls. Do you think we'll get matching striped outfits?" Mrs. Brockett's glare could have melted steel. "Mabel, you imbecilic sow, this is all your fault. If you hadn't decided to baptize the Reverend in brandy, we wouldn't be in this mess." Now, Clutterbuck interjected, unlocking the cell door with the practised ease of a man who'd rather be anywhere else. "Let's not assign blame. The important thing is that you both have a chance to, contemplate your actions." As the cell door clanged shut behind them, Mrs. Brockett surveyed her new accommodations with an expression of utter horror. The cell was small, dank, and furnished with nothing more than two narrow cots and a bucket of dubious purpose. "This is an outrage!" she screeched, her voice echoing off the stone walls. "I demand to speak to my husband. I demand to speak to the bishop. I demand to speak to the Queen herself, if necessary." Clutterbuck, already retreating down the corridor, called back, "I'm sure Mr. Brockett will be by in the morning, Mrs. Brockett. Try to get some rest, eh?" As the sound of the constable's footsteps faded away, Mrs. Brockett turned to Mabel, her eyes blazing with the intensity of a lady who'd just discovered her name misspelt in the parish newsletter. "Well," she demanded, "what have you got to say for yourself?" Mabel, who had already bagged herself the one cot which appeared only half soiled, blinked owlishly. "Bit bare bones, ain't it? Could do with a nice cushion or two, maybe a potted plant in the corner." Mrs. Brockett's screech of rage caused several rats in the vicinity to reconsider their living arrangements. "A potted plant! A potted plant! We are incarcerated, Mabel, imprisoned, confined, and it's all because of your infernal drinking." Mabel considered this for a moment, then brightened. "Well, if it weren't for me, Tipple, you'd be stuck here all by your lonesome, wouldn't you? I'm giving you company, I am. Moral support and all that." "Moral support?" Mrs. Brockett's voice reached a pitch that threatened to shatter the small barred window. "The only thing I've ever seen you support is the local brewery's profit margins. and a perpetual pitchfork aimed at my nerves. As the night wore on, the cell became a battleground of verbal warfare. Mrs. Brocket, pacing back and forth like a caged tiger in mourning attire, unleashed a tirade that covered everything from Mabel's parentage, questionable, to her intelligence, negligible, to her personal hygiene habits, best left undiscussed in polite company. Mabel, for her part, seemed to treat the entire experience as a particularly entertaining theatrical performance. She alternated between offering unhelpful suggestions for redecorating their cell and reminiscing about her colourful past experiences with law enforcement. "Did I ever tell you about the time I got arrested at the village fete, Mrs. B? Right old mix-up, that was. How was I supposed to know the pig I was riding weren't part of the livestock competition?" Mrs. Brocket, who had finally exhausted herself and collapsed onto the remaining cot, merely groaned in response. As dawn began to break, casting a pale light through the tiny window, Mrs. Brocket found herself staring at the ceiling, contemplating how her life had come to this point. She had entered the week as a respected, or at least feared, pillar of lesser Mudbury society. Now she was a jailbird, sharing accommodations with her inebriated maid and a bucket of indeterminate purpose. "Mabel," she said, her voice hoarse from hours of berating, "when we get out of here, things are going to change. I'll not have my reputation tarnished any further by your liquid indiscretions." Mabel, who had been softly snoring, stirred at this. "Whatever you say, Mrs. B," she mumbled, still half asleep. "But if you ask me, your reputation could use a bit of tarnishing. Gives it character, it does." Before Mrs. Brocket could formulate a suitably scathing response, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed down the corridor. Both women sat up, anticipating their release from this nightmare. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by the familiar sound of Mr. Brocket's measured tread. Mrs. Brocket leapt to her feet, smoothing her ruined funeral dress with trembling hands. "Henry!" she called out, her voice wavering between command and desperation. "Henry, get me out of this wretched place at once!" Mr. Brocket appeared before the cell, looking remarkably well rested for a man whose wife had spent the night in jail. Constable Clutterbuck stood beside him, twirling his ring of keys with studied nonchalance. "Ah, my dear," Mr. Brocket said, surveying the scene before him. "I trust you had a restful night?" "Restful?" Mrs. Brocket's voice could have withered an entire garden party's worth of prize roses. "How dare you stand there looking so composed? I've been languishing in this cesspit with nothing but that wine-soaked menace for company." "Oi!" Mabel protested from her cot. "How many times do I gotta tell ya? It ain't wine I drink, it's proper spirits. Got me standards, ain't I?" Constable Clutterbuck cleared his throat meaningfully, catching Mr. Brocket's eye. "Perhaps, sir, if I might have a word, in private." Mr. Brocket nodded, following the constable a short distance down the corridor. Mrs. Brocket pressed herself against the bars, straining to hear their hushed conversation. "Thing is, Mr. Brocket," Clutterbuck's voice drifted back, barely audible, "regulations state I could keep them here another day. For public safety, you understand." Mrs. Brocket's gasp of outrage was drowned out by Mabel's sudden bark of laughter. "Blimey, Mrs. B, looks like your husband's about to get himself a day off." "Shut up, you addle-pated harpy," Mrs. Brocket hissed, still trying to eavesdrop. "Henry would never, he wouldn't dare." But as she watched, she saw her husband's posture shift from its usual defeated slump to something almost hopeful. He was nodding at whatever Clutterbuck was saying, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Right then," Clutterbuck announced, returning to the cell. Bit of a situation, ladies. Seems there's some, paperwork that needs processing. Might take another day to sort it all out. Mrs. Brocket's screech of rage caused several spiders to abandon their webs in search of quieter hunting grounds. "Henry! Henry Brocket! You spineless, treacherous worm! I know exactly what you're doing!" Mr. Brocket, already backing away, managed to look both guilty and relieved. Now, my dear, surely one more day of quiet reflection wouldn't go amiss after yesterday's unfortunate incidents. Reflection? Reflection? Mrs. Brocket's face had taken on a dangerous hue. The only thing I'll be reflecting on is how to make you regret this betrayal until your dying day. As Mr. Brocket beat a hasty retreat, Mabel sat up, suddenly alert. She'd been watching Constable Clutterbuck with the calculating eye of someone who'd talked her way out of more than one sticky situation. "Here now, Constable!" she called out, her voice taking on a honeyed tone that made Mrs. Brocket's blood run cold. "That's a fine uniform you got there. All them shiny buttons. Must take ages to polish 'em all by yourself." Clutterbuck, despite his years of maintaining law and order, found himself blushing. "Well, yes, as a matter of fact." "Shame, that is," Mabel continued, twirling a strand of her frizzy hair. "A big, strong bloke like you shouldn't have to waste time on such things. If I weren't stuck in here, I'd be more than happy to give them buttons a proper shine." Mrs. Brocket watched in horror as her maid transformed from a perpetually soused liability into something approaching a coquette, albeit one with questionable grammar and a slight hiccup. "You wouldn't believe how good I am with me hands," Mabel continued, batting her eyelashes. "Polishing, cleaning, whatever tickles your fancy. And I brew a mean cup of tea, too. Strong enough to stand a spoon in, just the way a working man likes it." Clutterbuck's face had grown progressively redder. "Well, I suppose that is to say, course," Mabel sighed dramatically. "Can't do much from in here, can I? Such a waste, really. A lively gal like me, locked up when I could be making myself useful." Mrs. Brocket, catching on to Mabel's strategy, felt her jaw drop in disbelief. "Mabel, have you completely lost what little sense you possessed? This is hardly the time for what, Mrs. B?" Mabel winked at the constable. "Just having a friendly chat with our gracious host, ain't I? Showing proper respect for the law, like you're always telling me to do." Clutterbuck, now fumbling with his keys, cleared his throat. "Perhaps, given the circumstances, one of you could be released early. For good behaviour, you understand." "Oh, that'd be grand!" Mabel clapped her hands together. "And I know just how to show me gratitude. Me Aunt Gertie taught me a special way to make shepherd's pie, but I'd need a proper kitchen, not a jail cell, to whip it up." The keys jangled as Clutterbuck unlocked the cell door. "Miss Mabel, if you'd care to step out, Mrs. Brocket can continue her reflection." "You cannot be serious!" Mrs. Brocket lunged for the door, only to have it slam shut in her face. "Mabel, get back here this instant. I forbid you to leave." "Sorry, Mrs. B," Mabel called back cheerfully, already heading down the corridor on Clutterbuck's arm. "Duty calls, don't it? Got to do me part for law and order. You just stay put and reflect on things. Maybe make friends with them rats. They seem more your sort, anyway." As her maid's cackling laughter faded away, Mrs. Brocket sank onto her cot, overcome by the sheer audacity of it all. She, the mistress of the house, was to remain imprisoned while her servant sashayed off to freedom on the arm of the law. "When I get out of here," she muttered darkly to herself, "there will be changes. Oh yes, there will be changes indeed." A rat, braver than its companions, ventured out to regard her with what seemed to be sympathy. Mrs. Brocket glared at it. "And what are you looking at?" she demanded. "I suppose you think this is amusing, do you? Well, let me tell you something. I've hosted dinner parties for Lady Uppington. After that, a night in jail is practically a holiday." The rat, apparently unconvinced by this argument, scurried back to its hole, leaving Mrs. Brocket alone with her thoughts and the growing realization that her social standing in Lesser Mudbury might never quite recover from this latest indignity. As afternoon crept towards evening, Mrs. Brocket had exhausted every possible means of entertaining herself, including counting the stones in the wall, 247, naming the resident spiders, all variations of Agatha after Lady Uppington, and composing a mental list of ways to make Mabel's life a living hell upon her release. The relative quiet was shattered by the sound of a commotion in the corridor. Constable Clutterbuck's voice, strained with exertion, preceded the appearance of 3 of Lesser Mudbury's least desirable citizens. "Right then, in you go," the constable grunted, shepherding his new charges into Mrs. Brocket's cell. "And mind your manners, you've got company." Mrs. Brocket recoiled as her new cellmates shuffled in. There was Ned Grubb, the notorious chicken thief, whose personal aroma suggested an aversion to water in any form, Molly Scrabble, a woman whose profession was never discussed in polite company, and Tom Toothless Tucker, whose nickname was his most appealing feature. "Well, well," Molly cackled, displaying a set of teeth that appeared to have been arranged by a drunken carpenter. "If it ain't the grand Lady Brocket herself, slumming it with us common folk, are we?" Mrs. Brocket pressed herself against the far wall, clutching her handkerchief to her nose. "Constable, you cannot possibly expect me to share accommodations with these criminals?" Ned Grubb supplied helpfully, scratching at something that was hopefully just a flea. "Ain't we all the same in here, m'lady? Just birds of a feather, like them chickens I definitely didn't steal from Farmer Hodges' yard." "The only thing we have in common," Mrs. Brocket spat, "is this temporary proximity, which I assure you will end the moment I'm released. And do stop scratching. You're shedding something." Toothless Tucker settled himself on the cot Mrs. Brocket had been avoiding, producing a noise that suggested several small animals had taken up residence in his clothing. "Might as well get comfortable," he wheezed. "Word is you've got another day in here. Plenty of time for us to get acquainted." Mrs. Brocket's shriek of horror brought Constable Clutterbuck hurrying back. "Is everything all right in there?" "All right?" Mrs. Brocket's voice had reached a pitch that made the rats cover their ears. "I am sharing a cell with individuals whose combined personal hygiene wouldn't fill a thimble. This is beyond endurance." The constable shifted uncomfortably. "Well, there might be a way to secure your early release." Mrs. Brocket practically threw herself at the bars. "Name it. Whatever it is, I'll do it." "There's this charitable event coming up next week," Clutterbuck began cautiously. "We're always looking for volunteers." Yes, fine." Mrs. Brocket waved her hand dismissively as Molly Scrabble began demonstrating what appeared to be a particularly vigorous form of scratching. "I'll donate money, organise a committee, whatever you want. Just get me out of here." Clutterbuck produced a document. "If you'll just sign here, agreeing to provide your services." Mrs. Brocket snatched the paper and scrawled her signature without reading it, a decision she would soon come to regret with every fibre of her being. "Excellent!" Clutterbuck beamed, unlocking the cell. "Mabel will be so pleased to have your assistance." Mrs. Brocket, already halfway through the door, froze. "Mabel!" "Oh, yes. She's organising the whole thing. Charity beer and bingo night at the Fox and Ferret. She'll be running it, of course, and you'll be helping her serve drinks and call numbers. She was quite specific about wanting you under her direction." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Ned Grubb's persistent scratching and Molly Scrabble's wheezing laughter. She... Mrs. Brockett sputtered, her face cycling through shades that would have scandalized even the most experimental of milliners. "This is a trick, a conspiracy. I demand to see that document again." "All signed and witnessed, I'm afraid," Clutterbuck said cheerfully. "Legally binding. Mabel was quite insistent about that part. Something about making sure you couldn't wriggle out of it." Mrs. Brockett sagged against the wall, visions of social ruin dancing before her eyes. "Beer and bingo, with Mabel in charge? I'd rather stay here with the chicken thief and his collection of parasites." "Too late for that," Clutterbuck replied, ushering her towards the exit. "Uniform's already been ordered. An efficient one, is that, Mabel? Hang on to her type while you can." Mrs. Brockett stood motionless for a moment, stunned for words, before gradually stumbling out into the fading daylight. She could still hear the raucous laughter of her former cellmates echoing behind her. The thought of Mabel, gleefully planning her public humiliation, made her clench her fists so tightly her knuckles cracked. "Oh, and Mrs. Brockett," Clutterbuck called after her. "Mabel suggested roping you in for a bit of training. Something about teaching you the proper way to pull a pint." Mrs. Brockett's response was fortunately lost in the evening breeze, though several passing birds almost dropped out of the sky from her language. As she made her way home, her once elegant funeral dress now bearing the distinct aroma of jail cell and questionable company, Mrs. Brockett contemplated her immediate future. She, who had once hosted Lady Uppington's annual garden party, would now be serving ale to the common folk of Lesser Mudbury under the direction of her own maid. The final indignity came as she passed the Fox and Ferret, where Mabel stood in the doorway, deep in conversation with Constable Clutterbuck. Upon seeing her employer, Mabel's face split into a grin that would have made a shark uncomfortable. "Evening, Mrs. B," she called out cheerfully. "Just planning next week's event. Don't worry, I've got your uniform all sorted. Found one in me old collection that'll fit you just right. Bit faded, maybe, but then again, so's your reputation." Mrs. Brockett quickened her pace, her mind already racing with plans for revenge. But deep down, she knew that for once she had been outmanoeuvred. The social calendar of Lesser Mudbury would soon feature such a sight to behold: Mrs. Penelope Brockett serving beer and calling bingo numbers under the direction of her triumphant maid. Had she known this would be the price of her early release, she would have gladly spent another day sharing living space with Ned Grubb's fleas. At least they had better manners than Mabel.